This is such a cool view. Plotted on this map here, this is temperature at 500 millibars. So we're well up into the atmosphere here, kind of like the mid-levels, if you will, maybe even a little bit above that. And also plotted is those streamlines of the winds at the exact same height there. So I'm actually expand this out, and what we're looking at here are those very cold upper air temperatures. Now you can kind of think of the troughs that we often talk about moving through either the shortwave or the longwave troughs like a pool or a pocket of very cold air aloft, at least relative cold air to the area surrounding the trough. And this is a good example of this here. So if we watch those winds moving around at 500 millibars, essentially the jet stream here, you can see this big, what I would call a long wave trough. There's a short wave trough here. So that's kind of a smaller amplification of this broader long wave trough. But within that trough, right, is that pocket of cold air. And so because we have temperature plotted on here, you can see that very cold air in that pink color there. And it's very cold. This is really kind of a small lobe or a kind of a cutoff of the tropospheric polar vortex that is always held up somewhere here around the Arctic and the polar regions, but you can get these little lobes of it that cut off, plunge down into the continental US or down into Europe or portions of Asia and cause those very cold temperatures and sometimes quite a bit of snow depending on how they move in. Now I'm going to blow this up and pull it over the northern hemisphere so you can get a better idea of what I mean by that. If you really want that coldest air, the kind of the center of that vortex, if you will, I mean, you're talking maybe somewhere up here, but these lobes can break off like you're seeing here, and those can push these very cold, Arctic-like temperatures down further into the continental U.S. And so that's why we're always looking for the strength of that polar vortex as we go through the time. If it weakens, kind of counterintuitively, it's more likely that one of those lobes is able to sneak out, escape, and come down and impact our weather and bring brutal temperatures. And that's what it's doing here this morning, especially over Ontario and Quebec. If we look up there, temperatures are very, very cold, not plotted, but well into the negatives here. And across the Northeast, very cold temperatures down to the single digits across the Corn Belt, -18 up in Eau Claire, -13 Fargo, and then if you look over into New England, also into the single digits. Below that, over that snowpack that we've been watching over the last few days, finally seeing some moderation in those temperatures, so back up into the 20s. It's funny mentioning the 20s as if they're relatively warm for some of these areas, but I think once we get into next week, we'll look at those temperatures in a bit. That melt might be coming for some of that southern end of the snow swath, if you will. But either way, very cold morning here that we're looking at. And kind of give you a next example of that polar vortex, always kind of held up somewhere here, obviously over the North Pole for the northern polar vortex. But when it gets weaker, it allows this escape of cold air, and that's exactly what we're seeing here. And we can measure this by the strength of that wind flowing around the center of the polar vortex. If this is really strong and that wind is very coherent, it contains that cold air very well. But as it gets weak, it allows those undulations, it allows those escapes to get down to, where we're living, down here, either in Canada or down in the continental U.S. at times. And we track this. Eric shows, figures like this before, and what we're looking at here is the strength of that vortex with time. Now, in the red, on the left side of this chart, that is historical, so 2025 up through kind of January here. And then it flips over into a forecast in orange. And you can see that we recently had a weakening in the polar vortex, likely perhaps connected to the recent winter storm and this cold air outbreak. Now, we have a brief strengthening here that's undergoing at the moment, and then we're expected to come back down into another one of these weak polar vortex scenarios by the middle of February. So that's why we've highlighted maybe the middle to latter part of February for the potential for another kind of winter weather outbreak across the continental U.S., right, depending on where that trough situates. And we always got to follow this. If you think about where we were in November, remember how cold we were to start, I want to say to start winter, but really it was to end fall, especially meteorological fall, where at the end of November we got very, very cold. And then, of course, that the holidays came around and, that strengthened and we had a very warm kind of holiday season, and then as we worked our way back into January, we started to get some more variable weather, warm to start, and then various shots of cold air, ultimately culminating in the cold air outbreak that we just saw. So always looking at the strength of that polar vortex. Now, we can also plot it looking down from the northern hemisphere, and this is looking at the stratospheric polar vortex, and often the changes in what I just said, the tropospheric polar vortex, occur sort of downstream from this or below and a little bit after what's occurring above our heads. So there's two components to the polar vortex. One is well above our head at 10 millibars. That's the one we kind of focus on with respect to how strong it is. And as that one weakens, the tropospheric polar vortex, the one I started this video showing you, This is the one that sits at the mid-levels of our atmosphere and steers a lot of that cold air, can change as a result of that. So often when we're plotting these, we're measuring the strength initially of that stratospheric polar vortex. And that's what we're looking at here. If I take this plot, February 6th, 7th, 8th, what you're seeing here, these rising heights right over the North Pole, that indicates weakness in that polar vortex. This is the GFS ensemble. It's been pretty consistent in this shift into a weaker polar vortex as we get toward mid-February, and you can see those lobes break off over Canada, portions of Russia. And now this isn't to say it's going to be really cold here. It's going to be really cold here, but it does increase the chances for the tropospheric polar vortex. That's one further to the surface where we live, affecting our weather, can break off somewhere down here, causing inclement weather. So that's kind of putting that all together, what we look at kind of in the heart of winter to see when the next big cold air outbreak is most likely to happen. And this lines up a little bit too. If you think about, we're looking at this brief moderation, this warm up in early February. And then we're waiting to see where the pattern's going to go. We have this MJO transition, which we'll talk about in just a second, but where we're going after that, kind of in the long range, that 13, let's say like 10, 11 plus days out, February 10th and beyond. We've looked at analogs as a guide, years that look pretty similar to this. Eric, just yesterday in the video, brought this up, where February's, and these analog years that look pretty similar to this one, ended up very cold over the northern plains, cold over portions of the prairie, high plains over by Montana as well, and over the Midwest. Not as cold, coincidentally, here over the east, where it's been so cold. We're going to have to talk about those cold temperatures over Florida here Sunday. We're going to have to talk about the snowfall coming for the Carolinas as a result of that polar vortex diving down into the eastern U.S. So be curious if that cold shifts back more so over the Midwest, northern plains. And it'd be interesting if we get precipitation in here, because this all lines up with a trough situated somewhere here like this, similar to kind of what Eric drew on the right there. All right, catching us up to present day here, we do see some rain showers coming into the Pacific Northwest here in the Willamette Valley, kind of Portland up through the Seattle-Tacoma area. We'll also see some snow showers here over the Central Plains, moving through portions of the Black Hills and through kind of the populated areas here through southeast Nebraska, like Omaha, starting to trickle in maybe to Missouri and Iowa just a little bit. Just some light snow showers moving through quickly. These aren't expected to strengthen too much throughout the day today, but that is moving through the middle part of the country. The other big story that we're watching here this weekend is that Carolina snowfall. So when I talked to you all on Tuesday, we were watching this low jump around in the model. So I just went ahead, let's see if I can make this a little bit bigger. Wanted to just start with that trend here. So this is the latest few runs of the ECMWF, and you don't see a wide trend here between where this is going to end up. It's kind of really honed in now. We're 48 hours out from this really starting to pick up in South Carolina and North Carolina with respect to snowfall. The models have been pretty consistent on putting it just offshore and making it race quickly to the northeast. And if you want a little tip here, what I always look at, which way is this low going to go? Staring at this image here, and it often follows the surface trough that's extending out from it. And the surface trough is often a warm front extending toward its northeast. And so where is the pressure, weakening relative to the position? And it's really this direction. Do you see that? If you look at the contours here, the isobars, see how they kind of extend this way? There's almost another low, connected to it at the end of that warm front. And so that low is likely, not always, but likely to follow that surface trough to the northeast. So this low, you can see it's kind of racing away from the mid-Atlantic and New England. And that tells me it's probably not going to wrap up and push into this area here. It could, but they tend to follow that warm front and that surface trough with respect to their trajectory. So if I pause the trend here and I play out the forecast now, not the trend, but the forecast, you see how it followed that surface trough very nicely toward the northeast, not, picking up snowfall over Pennsylvania and New York, really kind of keeping it off, maybe to Connecticut, Providence, portions of Massachusetts and Cape Cod. Have to be a watch for heavier snowfall there, but less of an event for maybe the Metro East that could have happened there. We'll play this together, just looking at the ECMWF precipitation and type forecast. You can see those showers here over the Pacific Northwest early. So I played this forecast forward. Those continue weekly here, weakening on Friday. Take it through Saturday, not much happening here. We do finally see an Alberta Clipper spin up, coincidentally over Saskatchewan, but yeah, it started over here in Alberta. Let's call it an Alberta Clipper. And then finally we can see South Carolina, especially the higher elevations there, western North Carolina near the Smokies, seeing the snowfall beginning on Saturday As that low consolidates, heavier snowfall spreads across the entirety of both those states. Starts to get very heavy on the barrier islands, likely some high winds associated with that deepening low here. Now this is Sunday morning. Watching that clipper behind it, now moving through the upper Midwest, Northwest Corn Belt, if you will. Red River of the North, seeing a light shot of snowfall there. It might be heavier a little bit in some cases, but relatively brief. And then as we go through the day Sunday, that low follows that surface trough to the northeast, kind of clips, if you will, New England. Certainly Rhode Island looking at snow, Boston, potentially Cape Cod, heavier snowfall, some high winds, portions of Maine. I think they call that down east, even though it's the northeast, which is always confusing, and then heading up into maritime Canada. That clipper weakening all the while on Monday and Tuesday, maybe bringing just a light snow showers to the Midwest as that kind of weekends. We're seeing another one of these systems form behind it, and potentially, at least as far as the ECMWF is concerned, a little bit of a southern surface trough or low trying to form in races across the Gulf Coast states. And at least on this run, don't want to put too much weight into this right now, tries to form additional Carolina snowfall, strangely enough, almost 9 to 10 days out, so I'll have to keep an eye on that. Otherwise, across the country, despite, I think this weekend, Sunday, another brief shot of rain showers for the Northwest, but clipper systems moving through, they all look fairly weak, and it just isn't a very active pattern right now for the continental U.S. We've been kind of tracking this story all week. We're flipping back over into this drier pattern. That's not good news, I think, for the West, where we were trying to build back in snowpack after kind of a meager winter here. And we talked about the southern Mississippi Valley. I mean, there's portions of overwintered drought in a lot of this area here. I don't have the updated drought monitor yet. I'm recording this before they published it, but this isn't going to help us work back some of that overwinter drought that we always think about heading into the new planting window here as we get toward March and April. I mean, planting starting soon in some places of the southern continental U.S. If we look at the ECMWF forecast for snowfall for this event, I'm going to play this forward. You're going to see those light showers that we just talked about here this morning. Not much, accumulating with those, kind of as we discussed. As we get closer on Saturday, by like lunchtime, starting to see those first flakes come down across the western Carolinas, even portions of far eastern Tennessee, maybe western Virginia. And by Sunday evening, which that flashed to you very quickly, already seeing accumulations up near like 5 inches. So if that's happening in 6 hours, that's almost an inch per hour of accumulation. That tells you pretty heavy snowfall now ongoing across portions of South Carolina, western North Carolina. So you go further overnight into the evening, you're talking 1 a.m. now on Sunday morning. And again, same kind of phenomenon here. You see these values here near Raleigh, south across northeast South Carolina, 7 inches in a short period of time. And that tells me some decently heavy snow is falling by 1 a.m. By 7 a.m., you can see very heavy snow now, Barrier Islands, Cape Hatteras. I mean, that is an impressive historic snowfall event for that area here. High winds potentially associated with that. I'll look at that in just a second. And you can see that snow starting to move up north, like Norfolk, skimming kind of the mid-Atlantic. So take this forecast forward. ECMWF, very aggressive on that line. Stretching somewhere, Providence maybe getting 3 inches, but you're talking like the northwest part of it not getting much. And then Cape Cod, maybe a foot of snow, just an impressively narrow event. And then by Monday morning, you can see additional kind of snow falling on the backside of that closer to Boston. But this is a scraper, man. I mean, it's just coming right up along that mid-Atlantic coast before clipping, the only area that really juts out, which is like Boston, portions of Rhode Island there and Cape Cod. So an impressive event, certainly for the Carolinas. There is this kind of question mark. Do we get one of these dry slots that pushes in here to portions of the Carolinas and prevents somebody in here from getting up into like 5 to 7 inch range? But there's a lot of potential in the far eastern part of North Carolina for a heavy snowfall event with some high winds there. I'm going to see if I can double back here and pull up those wind gusts. And I might have to jump over. Let's do the 3 kilometer NAM. Actually, I'm going to do the GFS because I want to get all the way through the forecast period here. So let's jump over. We're going to do Eastern U.S. It always takes me an extra time to find that. Actually, let's just do the continental U.S. Bring up those cumulative wind gusts. I'll play this forward here and get us out into Saturday evening. And now Sunday morning. This is now midnight Sunday. Winds picking up in the Barrier Islands near 60 miles an hour, potentially plus. Heavy snow coming down. That's a blizzard. That is a blizzard, no question, for that corridor there in the far eastern part of the state. Wind's going to pick up there in the Chesapeake Bay up into the 40s across the mid-Atlantic, at least the coastal regions, before finally spinning up into Cape Cod, where we could see values along the coast reach like 50 to 55 miles an hour as the system wraps up further to the northeast. But outside of like the Carolinas, outside of some of the higher elevation there on the Appalachians, not seeing as big of a wind event except for these areas kind of immediately on the coastline. Obviously, the Barrier Islands, looking at a likely blizzard scenario here. Another way we can look at this, just the probabilities through Sunday morning of receiving 6 inches plus, and you're getting up into like 80%. Some portions here of eastern North Carolina. Now, we do have that caveat that there could be this dry slot that forms here, somebody missing out a little bit, but otherwise a heavy snowfall event, and you can see that pushing up, even like trying to get toward the Delmarva here. A little bit, chances like 40 to 50% of a heavy snowfall, but there is some question mark as how far west this moves. Now, this does include, all right, if we extended this further, I bet it would nick, portions of Boston, or at least portions of Massachusetts, looking at like 5 to 8 inches, maybe a little bit more in some of the coastal regions here like Cape Cod. However, that's out into Sunday, so you're not seeing it here on the forecast here from the WPC. But otherwise, the Carolinas looking at a heavy snowfall event. They're being a little bit more bullish here in North Carolina, but South Carolina, looking at the potential for 2 inches plus, certainly to a pretty high degree of confidence across a large chunk of the state here. So at least the northern side of it. Impressive snowfall event, and the wind, it's going to be crazy to see the videos, I'm sure, from the Barrier Islands that are destined to come out from Saturday night and Sunday morning. If we do look at those overnight minimum temperatures, this is the forecast just for this morning here. You can see how cold we are across the eastern Corn Belt. We looked at that this morning. We're not quite as cold as -8 as the forecast. If I jump over and show you where we ended up, you're looking at maybe 0, -2 here, portions of like Cincinnati, southwest Ohio. So not quite that cold, but certainly a lot of cold air available with this system. It's kind of curious if you look at the swath of relatively warmer air. I say relatively because it's still single digits, albeit not negative. That's kind of downstream from Lake Michigan there. I can just about assure you, if we jump back and look at infrared cloud cover, that you're seeing lake effect clouds, right over that area. Now we have to look at them on infrared because visible's not up yet this morning, but you can see those clouds starting on Lake Michigan and emanating across kind of the eastern Corn Belt, keeping those temperatures down in the morning because they're preventing some of that radiational cooling from occurring. All right, I'm going to play that forecast forward into tomorrow on Friday. I see the cold air, obviously with that polar vortex diving down, it persists across much of the country, much of the eastern kind of half of the continental U.S., I should say. Very cold air kind of locked into a lot of these areas. That only continues on Saturday and amplifies across the plains, eastern Corn Belt, portions of Pennsylvania down into the negatives. Just based that we've been running a little bit warmer than this, somewhat skeptical we're going to get down into like the -5 to -10 territory, but certainly negatives possible. So the very cold temperatures across the plains that continues significantly on Sunday morning as that Arctic front races all the way down through Florida. And this could be the kind of historic event that Eric talked about yesterday. Now, the National Weather Service, the NDFD, is the National Digital Forecast Database. So putting the low temperature forecast together from the National Weather Service here, that's what you're looking at. You can see 21, 25 in Houston, 25 in New Orleans, 18 in Pensacola, Tallahassee at 18, Jacksonville at 20. This significant cold air, deep freeze, undoubtedly making it all the way down to the Gulf Coast. Look at Florida. Even down the spine of the state, getting close to Lake Okeechobee, getting down into freezing territory. 34 in Tampa, 38 in Miami. But just unbelievably cold air getting very, very far south across the country. 31 like near Corpus Christi. Now, if we look specifically at Sunday morning, which appears to be the coldest after the passage of that Arctic cold front, first of all, there's that cold air that we talked about over in the eastern Corn Belt, picking on them just because they're in the negatives, but really a lot of cold air across the Midwest and Mid-South here, Nashville down into the single digits potentially. This forecast is from the National Blend of Models. Now, this is a almost, I kind of want to call it an experiment of combining the different models to improve the 2-meter temperature forecast kind of out in this range. And those forecasts are actually even colder for Florida. You're talking down like 24, 25, 23 near Orlando, and you can really kind of see that freezing line getting all the way down close to the Everglades before spinning up. And southeast Florida, all these metro areas are just staying barely above freezing, but below freezing further to the north, up by Jacksonville. So this could be a historic cold air outbreak. You see the teens stretching back along the Gulf Coast, meeting up with some very, very low 20s back toward Louisiana and Texas. Just an impressive cold air event. And if I take this forecast out I'm going to take it back. We'll see Saturday. You can see that freeze arriving on the Gulf Coast further to the west on Saturday. But it's really Sunday morning where it's going to be more widespread. Monday still dealing with it, although the depth of the freeze not as bad. So you can see warming up above freezing territory in like Houston, portions of Louisiana, sticking around in Florida, but not to the degree that it was on Sunday morning. And by Tuesday, sort of a additionally moderating, but still seeing some freezes here. I mean, this is a multi-day potential deep freeze here across portions of Florida, areas of the citrus belt, across Georgia. This is going to be a historic event, it would seem. All right, I do have some good news with respect to temperatures. If I take you that same forecast for the high temperatures, obviously going to be cold across the eastern U.S. You're going to see very cold highs on Saturday and then Sunday across these areas. But if you look at the northern plains, we're getting that warm up on the backside of this as this ridge expands and elongates west to the east, finally seeing a moderation in temperatures across portions of the, let's call them western Midwest, even kind of the central Midwest and eastern Midwest. Your high temperatures getting up into, a respectable mid-20s. Feels relatively warm based on what we've been dealing with, and that continues on Tuesday, more so on Wednesday. Just a broader moderation of the temperatures across this region, even getting back above average along the Gulf Coast by the middle part of next week. I think that's the last day I have in the forecast bin here. Remaining cool in the east, remaining cool in New England, but you can see this broader warming trend in the middle part of the country lining up with that moderation, that warm up, if you will, that we've talked about in early February. Now, if I look at the long range, Eric, I think mentioned it very well yesterday. We got to get out of this persistence with this dominant ridge over the western U.S. Now, I mentioned just a second ago that this ridge is going to be expanding next week. So really only entrenching this pattern where we have a ridging here, some sort of troughing here in the east. This is the ECMWF ensemble. This little trough that you can see here late next week on Thursday was responsible for that little system moving through that we saw through the Gulf Coast. Much warmer temperatures, drier across the west. We saw that, or at least an illustration of that in the precipitation anomalies. And this takes us out into late next week. There's that broadening or the elongation of that trough, or the ridge. The trough moving further toward New England and the eastern U.S. That's allowing the temperatures to warm up. In this corridor here, we mentioned like Houston, the Midwest, northern plains getting warmer next week. This continues, we think, through the weekend. And then where we go after that is in question. As we get out into mid-February, we're going to see one of these cold air outbreaks again. Is this ridge going to break down across the west and get replaced by a trough? I think that would help some precipitation in this region. Certainly help precipitation, we would think, downstream of that, the lee side of the Rockies. But this is well out into the forecast, 354 hours. The models have a tendency to flip that trough there. I've noticed in late January and early February here, so I can't put a lot of weight into this, but it wouldn't surprise me if around the 10th to 11th, we're starting to see the beginnings of that mid-February pattern change. I don't know if it's going to play out exactly like this. Another thing I'm watching is the AI models at that range. They've done a pretty good job of that this year. If I just play the forecast of these lows and the precipitation out, I'm looking next week. This is Wednesday the 4th. On the ECMWF proper, this was a little low that snuck through the Gulf Coast states. Didn't even really have a winter component until it got over to the Carolinas, where it coincidentally brought another rare snowfall, South Carolina, North Carolina. Well, in the AIFS, it looks quite a bit different. A more proper low moving through the middle Mississippi Valley. It's got this cold front associated with it, bringing rain showers to the mid-south. Along the lower Mississippi Valley, probably transitioning to a wintry mix or snow across the Midwest next Wednesday. I think we saw temperatures kind of climbing up near that freezing territory there. And that moves through the mid-Atlantic. This would be a snowfall maker for the Northeast. There's still a clipper on the backside of it for the upper Midwest. Would be a rainfall maker for areas to the south of it. So there's some question marks on this system next week. This is only 6 days out. Is it going to be a stronger system that pushes through in the Midwest? Is it going to be weaker and kind of hug the coastline? Maybe I can get it to pull up here on the GFS just to get that other opinion here. I'm going to take this out quickly. Forgive me. Yeah, weaker system from the GFS, more in line, I think, with the ECMWF proper, not the AIFS, kind of cutting it through the Gulf Coast states, getting into Tennessee, bringing a shot of snowfall to Kentucky, less to the Carolinas, maybe some to Virginia, but less significant of an event that we saw from the ECMWF AIFS. Some more rain potential for the southern tier of the U.S., I think, after that into early February. We saw some of that, I think, in the long-range outlook that we've been watching this week, at least with respect to the CPC precip outlook. But if we look at that same 8 to 14-day temperature outlook, right, it's still looking more of the same warm west, cool east, and this moderating zone in the middle of it. Precipitation dry across the board for much of the continental U.S., save for areas under the influence of those clippers or are these kind of weak lows sneaking up out of the southern tier of the U.S.? I mentioned earlier we're watching that transition in the MJO, currently somewhere like phase 7 into phase 8, but expecting a rapid transition over into phase 1. But you'll notice earlier in the week this looked more like this, and I mentioned on Tuesday it's moderating a bit, weakening a bit, and we're not seeing the same level of amplification. So I think this adds some more uncertainty in that mid-February zone where we're kind of waiting and watching for that pattern change, potential cold air outbreak if that polar vortex weakens sufficiently. And this just remains kind of a story we're going to have to watch with some added uncertainty now, given it looks a bit weaker. I will say, if you look at the long-range forecast from the ECMWF, this extended forecast, this is precipitation anomalies. I took this out as far as I should, or I can. I shouldn't say I should. Somewhat irresponsible to try to put up a forecast here for 45 days out. But doing so, at least from the ECMWF extended model, shows precipitation in 2 corridors here. And this tells me we're going to have flow here, trough here, and plenty of precipitation for the middle part of the country in the eastern U.S. under a scenario that looks like this. And this is taking us out a little bit into spring here, the halfway point of March. And it lines up with those analogs Eric showed. He showed this yesterday with potentially a trough like this, where you have flow coming into the northwest, you have flow coming out of the southwest. That's how you get a lot of precipitation in this region here. Maybe some snowfall for the upper Midwest as a result of that warmer across the southeast. Drier for the southern tier, drier for these areas that have missed out on some snowpack and that are lacking some precipitation here. So watching Texas pretty closely, because a lot of the analogs this year, some of our long-range forecasts included, have started to highlight this like plains or southern plains spring drought signal. So the fact that it's already showing up in the ECMWF extended model means that maybe I got to worry about this a little bit more. So as we go through February, this area is going to become more of a concern, just given that Eric and I are going to focus on to see if we're going to see expanding drought in this area here. It's too early to say, hey, that's 100% going to happen, obviously, but given some of the stars aligning, it's worth mentioning. I'll leave it there today. That's my last slide. Thanks for watching, and Eric will talk with you all tomorrow on Friday.